When the war is won, we will be sure, we will be sure. Oh, glory, 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 oh, glory.
Hello and welcome to today's meeting of Democrats of Greater Tucson. My name is Larry Bodine and I'm the president. We have a fascinating speaker today. Daniel Hernandez, running for Congress, is going to speak. Daniel Hernandez is a state representative now in the current LD2, and he's also a former school board president and a lifelong Arizonan, now running for Congress in Tucson's own CD6. Since 2017, Daniel has served in the Arizona House, and he was one of the youngest legislators elected, and he's a co-founder of the LGBTQ caucus in the House. He's also worked with Republicans and Democrats to pass bills protecting survivors of sexual assault and to secure $20 million for school resource officers. And he also led the fight against legislation that would discriminate against LGBTQ Arizonans. And with that, Daniel, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Larry. It's so good to see so many familiar names. Maybe not so many faces because not everybody has their cameras on, but it is so good to be back with DGT. Hopefully at some point we'll be able to do this in person again, and we can get some good Chinese food and share a nice time in Tucson. Well, I am Daniel Hernandez. I'm a state representative who is currently in LD2, which makes up the southeast part of Pima County. So I have Davis Mountain Air Force Base. I have the city of South Tucson, Green Valley, Sahuarita, all the way down to the border, and have all of Santa Cruz County. And it's been such an honor and such a joy to be able to spend the last 6 years representing Southern Arizona alongside my good friend and dear colleague, Representative Andrea D'Alessandro, who is retiring after this term. So we're both leaving the House at the same time, but it's been an absolute joy to be able to spend the last 2 years serving together with her in the House. And before that, she was our senator. So I wanted to give a big shout out to Representative D'Alessandro for her longtime friendship and support and her work to represent the folks in LD2. So I'm running for the open congressional seat, but before I tell you a little bit more about the open congressional seat and why I'm running, I want to tell you a little bit more about me. I know a lot of you have probably heard some part of my story because I've seen so many of you over the last 14 years that I've been involved in Tucson politics. So if you've heard this before, I apologize, but wanted to kind of set the foundation of who I am as a Democrat, who I am as a candidate, and who I am as an elected official. So my sisters are both joining us today. And it's funny because one of the most foundational experiences of my life was actually when I was 5 years old with both of my sisters. We're pretty sure it was Alma. But during one of the days that we were just hanging out at home, one of my sisters, again, we think it was Alma, decided it'd be funny to kick me when I was jumping up on the bed. You know, when you have little kids jumping up and down on beds, it can be a little dangerous, but it was more dangerous for us because there was a sharp metal filing cabinet with sharp edges that was right next to the bed. So when I got kicked, I fell backwards and hit the back of my head. And you can actually still see in the back of my skull where I ended up hurting my head and immediately start feeling a lot of pain. And then I start seeing blood. Both my sisters started to scream. And immediately my mother came in and said, "We have to go to the hospital." And I don't know about you, but for me, the only time I'd ever been to the hospital was to visit a family member who was dying. So when my mom came in and said, "We're going to the hospital," in my 5-year-old brain, that meant, now this is it. This is the end. I've lived a good life. I went to Disneyland, but now I'm dying. And this is in 1995, pre-cell phone. So she went ahead and actually called and let the hospital know that we were going. It was on the west side. St. Mary's was the nearest one to us at that point in my life. And as we started heading there, I started thinking, okay, you know, I'm dying. This is scary. This is a really horrible place that we're going to because hospitals are scary places. But as soon as we got there was a woman who was a nurse who was waiting for us in front of the hospital. My mom had made it seem like my head was barely attached to my body when she called because her baby was bleeding and crying. And when we get there, the nurse takes me into her arms and she says, "We're going to make everything okay. We're going to do everything we can to make you feel better." And she started taking a look at it and said, "You know, it's actually not as bad as it looks. We go inside the hospital and the doctor cleans me up and gives me 5 stitches. And after the end of giving me the 5 stitches, he also gave me a very crisp $5 bill, $1 for every stitch because I didn't cry. But he could still tell that I was nervous. So he said, Daniel, do you know what we do here? And I said, well, this is a hospital. This is where people come to die. I'm dying. And he kind of laughed and he said, no, actually, this is where people come to get better so they can go back to their families. So he goes and asks another patient and says, this is my assistant, Daniel. Is it okay if he listens to your heartbeat? So while we were waiting for the results from the scans, he gives me a stethoscope and I listen to this patient's heartbeat. It was at that moment that I decided this is what I wanted to do. I wanted to go into healthcare to help people because growing up on the south side of Tucson, I didn't have very many examples of people helping their community. But growing up, my grandmother had taught the 3 of us a very important lesson, which is pon tu granito de arena, which in Spanish means put in your grain of sand. This was an idea that she taught all of us that was about no matter how big or how small, no matter how rich or how poor, we all had something to contribute to make the world a better place. So there was this kind of value that my grandmother taught us that drove me. And then when the doctor showed me what he could do, which was to help people go back to their families, I said, I want to go into healthcare. So I was a student at Sunnyside Unified School District, and we have a wonderful public education program, as all of you on this call know. And I was very lucky to be able to train as a nursing assistant and as a phlebotomist. So by the time I graduated from high school, I had trained as a nursing assistant and as a phlebotomist, and also done 2 years of cancer research at the University of Arizona Cancer Center because I had decided I wanted to go into healthcare. This was what my path was. Well, at 17, I was sitting in my American history class and I looked around the room and I saw 40 men staring back at me. They all happened to be white. So I raised my hand and I asked my teacher one day, when was the last time a woman was president? And he said, well, women can't be president. They're too emotional to be president. I didn't like that answer. So I said, okay, well, if there haven't been any women, when was the last time a person of color was president? He said, well, that's not going to happen for a long time either. Keep in mind, this is in 2007, a year before President Obama won his first term. So not knowing anything about politics, not knowing anything about the system, I decided I wanted to do something, one, to diversify my resume so that when I applied for medical school, I wasn't just the nerdy science kid, but 2, because I wanted to make sure that we elected people that looked more like our communities. So when Hillary Clinton announced that she was running for president in 2007, the first time, I went onto her website not knowing what to expect. And I went ahead and Andrea is right, that's why women are too emotional because men are the ones that are starting most of the wars in global history. But I ended up signing up on the website, not knowing what to expect. And a couple of weeks later, got a call from a couple of older Jewish women in Tucson, many of whom have now since passed. But they called themselves the Yentas for Hillary. And they took me under their wing and showed me all the bad Yiddish words you're not supposed to use in front of polite company, how to make challah. But more importantly, what they taught me was the importance of talking to voters, talking to your community, hearing from them about what their needs were. So one of my favorite things now is actually knocking on doors. I hate talking on the phone, but I would knock on 10,000 doors and love it because it's such a great opportunity to be face-to-face with your friends, your neighbors, and the people around your community and hearing from them directly. So when that campaign ended, because in June of 2008, Hillary withdrew from the race, I said, I'm never working on another campaign ever again. I'm done with politics. And to give you a little bit of background, my family was not a political family at the time. It's kind of weird saying that now because I have 2 sisters, one of whom is a state representative and another one who's a school board member. But our family was not one that was very political. My father hadn't voted in 20 years until I made him re-register in 2008 to vote. And then my mother wasn't even an American citizen until 2016. She's an immigrant from Mexico. And one of the funny things is my mother became a citizen in 2016 to try and stop Donald Trump from becoming president, but she's never been able to vote for me. She's had the opportunity to vote for both of my sisters, but I've never lived in the same district as my mother. So my mother's never had an opportunity to vote for me for any of the offices that I've ever run for. But I said, I'm never working on another campaign ever again. I'm done with politics. I'm going to focus on going to medical school. Well, 3 days later, the same women that were the Yentas for Hillary became the Yentas for Gabby. They invited me to an event that was being held by Congresswoman Gabby Giffords. I had seen her on TV, read about her in the paper. But for me, it was a really interesting opportunity to be able to see the candidate in person. For Hillary, I only ever saw her on TV and heard her on the radio. She was more of an idea than a person at that point in my life. So I decided to go because they offered snacks and said that it would be a good opportunity to meet Gabby. And by the time she was done speaking, not only had I decided I wanted to help, but I'd actually asked the person who was there, Jen Cox, actually, who's now Mark Kelly's chief of staff, about becoming an intern. So by the time the event ended, I signed up to be an intern for Gabby after saying I'm never working on another campaign ever again. We got to spend a lot of time with her and her family. And I always share a funny story. My dad and Gabby's dad were seated at one of the debates against Jesse Kelly together. And Gabby's dad, Spencer, who's since passed on, was in a wheelchair, as was my dad. So they put him up towards the front. During the debate, they were both heckling the Republican candidate, Jesse Kelly, at the time in 2010. And during the break in the middle, I had to go up to my dad and remind him that it was not okay for him to be heckling the candidates from the audience. And he's like, well, he's doing it. I'm like, yeah, that's Gabby's dad. The candidate's dad. You're the intern's dad. You're not allowed to do that. So that was one really kind of fond memory that I have of Spencer and Gabby's mom, Jinx. And of course, Senator Mark Kelly, who is now serving as our junior senator here from Arizona. So after that campaign ended in 2010, Gabby asked me to intern in her congressional office. She'd been asking me to do it for years. And I said, I want to help people. This is something that I'm really interested in. But she did something that nobody had ever bothered to do before, which is ask me why I wanted to become a doctor. And this was, once again, something that helped change the direction of my life. So the first thing was having that incident at the hospital with my sisters and deciding I wanted to go into healthcare. But then Gabby, at the age of 18, at that point, it was 20 actually, asked me, why do you want to go into healthcare? And I said, it's because I want to help people. And she said, well, have you ever thought of being an advocate, being a voice for those who can't speak up for themselves? And for me, growing up in a very loud Mexican-American family, the idea of people not being able to speak up for themselves was a foreign concept. But I said, okay, what does that actually mean? She talked about the idea that there were many people who were having their lives impacted by decisions being made at a table that they weren't seated at. So an advocate would be somebody who could go lobby, go and talk to, and be an advocate for those who couldn't speak up for themselves because they weren't always at the decision-making table. So I literally Googled Arizona advocacy and found a wonderful organization called the Arizona Students Association. I ended up becoming an intern with them in 2008. So I started going up to the Arizona State House at the age of 18 and lobbying on behalf of all 3 state universities. And by the time I was 20 in 2010, after Gabby's campaign, I actually was able to work to pass a bill that had to do with student voting rights. I worked with then State Representative Matt Hines. He was our prime sponsor. We were able to get this bill passed and signed into law by, of all people, Jan Brewer. And it was something that was really important because we as students were able to build the relationships, get the work done, and pass an important and meaningful piece of legislation that impacted students at all 3 state universities. Then a couple of, it looks like someone's not muted and the dog's barking. But we were able to get this done by working with friends on the Democratic side and building relationships with Republicans to make this something that they cared about. In 2011, of course, many of you know January 8th was a day that changed the direction of my life once again. I had changed my major in 2010 from molecular and cellular biology to political science. I think something that still disappoints my mother heavily. I think she still wonders when I'm going to get a real job. But I changed my major because I decided I didn't want to go into healthcare anymore, that I wanted to go into advocacy. Because after passing that bill that impacted the lives of 150,000 students at the 3 state universities, I knew that I could have a bigger impact to help change and make the community better and the lives of those people who I was wanting to be an advocate for by going into policy. So I changed my major and thought I'm never going to work in healthcare ever again. And then I was asked to intern in Gabby's office. And on the 5th day of the internship in January of 2011 was the day that once again changed the direction of my life. It was the day of the Tucson shooting, where, as many of you know, all of Southern Arizona was deeply changed after that. I was working as an intern and I was the one who was signing people in when they were coming in to speak. So everybody who was shot that day, with the exception of John M. Roll, a federal judge, is someone that I had a personal relationship with or conversation with before they were injured or killed. There were 13 people that were injured, including Gabby, and 6 that were killed. I was able to use the skills that I'd learned in our quality public schools in Sunnyside to provide first aid to Gabby and to others when the shooting happened. And it was that moment that really sealed my decision on wanting to get involved and stay involved in advocacy. I saw that at this point, there were 6 other people who were no longer able to speak up for themselves because their lives were taken from us, and that there were 13 others who were horrifically injured, including Gabby. So I decided to get more involved. And in 2011, I started being approached by folks after seeing my record at the legislature, getting bills done, to run and consider running for the Sunnyside Unified School District Governing Board. Was not an easy decision because at 21, I said, I'm young. I don't know everything about K-12, but I'm passionate about advocating for the kids that are in this school to have better opportunities than what I had growing up. So I said, I'm going to wait and see who else files to run. And if nobody else runs, then I'll do it. Well, the day before the filing deadline, there was only one other candidate who had filed to run for the Sunnyside School Board. And I said, well, I wonder why she's running. And when we asked her, she said the reason she was running was to fire another employee in the district that had fired her. And I said, well, if that's the best that we have, then maybe I need to run. And in less than a day, we were able to collect the signatures to qualify to get on the ballot for the Sunnyside Unified School District Governing Board. That year, I myself knocked on about 7,500 doors in the Sunnyside Unified School District, talking to my friends and neighbors about my vision for making sure that all of the kids in Sunnyside had better opportunities than the ones that I had had, even though I'd only graduated 3 years earlier. And I was very lucky to win my first election to the Sunnyside Board. And right away, I saw that there was a lot of problems in Sunnyside. We had wonderful teachers who were wonderful advocates for students like me, but what we didn't have was a school board or an administration that really was focused on the success of our students. We had a lot of individual administrators, but they weren't being headed up by people who were focused on how do we get the best outcome for our kids. So after my very first board meeting, where my fellow board members decided to file an open meeting law complaint against me because I asked too many questions, they decided Daniel is not smart enough, he's too young, and he doesn't know what he's talking about. But the reality is I've always been a good student, so I just read all the materials that they'd sent me in the board book. And because I asked the difficult questions that they weren't ready for, they thought that there was somebody else feeding me information. Well, after the AG did an investigation, they found out nobody had given me any information other than the school district. And right away, I got off on the wrong side because my fellow board members who were in the majority saw me as a threat because I was holding them accountable. For 18 months, my closest friend on the board was Buck Crouch, who at the time was a libertarian and is now a Democrat. He saw the light and joined us on the Democratic side. But at the time, we were always trying to hold people accountable and kept asking for more information. Well, the people that had been there for 20 years didn't particularly like that. So after 18 months, they tried to recall both myself and Buck. They needed 1,300 signatures and they couldn't get them. So after the recalls against us failed, Alma, myself, and several other community members, including Consuelo and a gentleman named Richard Hernandez, mobilized the community. And what we were able to do was take on a 15-year incumbent on the school board and start a recall. And we were successful in getting 2,300 signatures against one and 2,400 signatures against the other. And after the recalls against me failed, we were able to recall them. And I went from being in a 2-3 minority to being in a 4-1 majority, becoming the youngest president in Sunnyside School District history at 24, the first openly gay president as well. And what I did when I got there is, let's get back to the basics. Let's make sure that we're focused on creating good opportunities for our students so that they can have a good learning environment and so that staff has a good working environment. So one of the things that I did is I worked with our 3 unions because we had an administrators, classified and certified employee union to do a compensation study to figure out where were the staff in Sunnyside compared to their peers in Pima County. So we were able to work together to create raises during the middle of a hard year. So even though we were receiving cuts from the states, most of the employees in Sunnyside were able to receive a raise. And we did that by bringing people up who were at the bottom level. And we were able to get an agreement amongst the 3 different unions to say the people who are making less the least amount, 25% or more below what the market is here in Pima County. Let's bring them up. Let's bring them up so that they're making what their peers are making. And then let's work together and collaboratively so that all the other staff in Sunnyside can get some level of raises. And I did that by cutting over $700,000 from administrative costs after the superintendent left. And then we did a national superintendent search. And funnily enough, we found a wonderful superintendent right here in our own backyard, Mr. Steve Holmes. And then after about 6 months of being the president of the school board, I said, I'm only going to do this for 6 months. I don't want to do this anymore. I want to focus on going back and doing the advocacy work at the state capitol. But my peers elected me once again. So I ended up serving 18 months as a Sunnyside School Board president. During that time, we did the compensation study. We passed comprehensive sex education. We also worked together to create a better culture for our staff and for our employees. Then in 2014, I was asked if I'd be willing to be appointed to the state legislature for a seat from a retiring member of the legislature. Wasn't old enough. And because I wasn't old enough, we ended up having Representative D'Alessandro move to the Senate. And then we had another vacancy in the House. Somebody got appointed and they ended up losing that seat in 2014 to a Republican. And then in 2016, I worked as a candidate to take back a seat from Republicans in what was one of the most competitive elections for the legislature in 2016. When I got to the legislature, there were a lot of things that I already knew coming in. It was my 8th year going to the state capitol. So even though I was 26 and the youngest member of the state house and one of the youngest members of the legislature, I had had the most amount of experience of many of the people in the Democratic caucus. The only few that had a little bit more experience than I did were our minority leader, Rebecca Rios, and Representative D'Alessandro. So I came in with 8 years of relationships and experience and was actually able to fairly quickly at the legislature establish myself as someone who's able to get things done. And I think that's one of the things that has been a hallmark of my time at the Arizona State House. Whether it was making sure that we added new protections for the victims of sexual assault, I worked with one of my most conservative colleagues, Maria Sims, to pass a law that provided a new protection so that the victims of sexual assault could get out of unsafe living environments. And it ended up eventually getting signed into law by Doug Ducey. I was also able to work with my colleagues in 2019 to do something that was really important to me. For years in Arizona, it was illegal for people in the LGBTQ community to even be discussed in Arizona public schools. In 1991, as a part of a compromise, the LGBTQ community was thrown under the bus by folks on both sides of the aisle. At the height of the AIDS crisis, there was a decision made that we needed to teach kids about HIV and AIDS, but we couldn't promote this alternative, so-called alternative lifestyle. So Republicans and Democrats came together in a compromise and said, well, what we're going to do is we're going to teach kids about HIV and AIDS, but what we're going to do is we're going to say you cannot promote homosexuality as a healthy alternative lifestyle. And by doing that, there was a chilling effect on Arizona public schools where it was now seen as illegal to even mention or acknowledge that the LGBTQ community existed. We couldn't talk about people like Harvey Milk. We couldn't talk about Billie Jean King. We couldn't mention the LGBTQ community because so many school districts and schools were worried about being sued because of the way that the language was written. So in 2019, after 28 years of this being the law of the land, I was able to work collaboratively with my Republican colleagues to repeal that section of statute, getting a progressive win, something that the LGBTQ community had been asking for over 2 decades, by working to make sure that we showed to my Republican colleagues that, one, you can be a member of the LGBTQ community, be healthy, successful, and also we don't need to look at what happened in 1991 and take it just as something that we need to accept. We worked together and repealed that in 2019. 2019 was also a really important year for me because we found out, as we got a report from the Arizona Counselors Association, that in our public schools, there was a ratio of about 1 to 900. For every one counselor, there were 900 students. That was one of the worst ratios in the country. The average was 1 to 250. So I worked alongside Senator Sean Bowie, Senator Heather Carter, and Representative Gina Cobb to create what we call the School Safety Fund, where students and where school districts and charters could apply to get funding for either a school resource officer, a school counselor, or a school social worker. After we created this $20 million fund, we got over $100 million in requests. And thankfully, because of the Biden administration and the Democratic Congress, we were able to get funds through ARPA and the CARES Act. And by working collaboratively with Kathy Hoffman, our state superintendent, we were able to actually get the backlog of requests funded so that every school that had asked for a counselor, social worker, or a school resource officer was finally able to get that because of the money that we got, and that they got 2-year grants to make sure that there wasn't just a position that was filled for 1 year. So I'm very proud of my record at the legislature of getting things done. So I'll wrap up because I know Larry said we want to take a couple of questions. But I'm running for Congress because we need somebody who can deliver results for Southern Arizona. I've been involved in our community my entire life, but for the last 14 years, I've been an advocate who has shown that you can work across the aisle to actually get things done while not compromising on our values. The last good gun bill that came out of Arizona was in 2014, one that I wrote as the state director for Everytown for Gun Safety, signed into law by Jan Brewer, and we had a public bill signing with survivors of gun violence, law enforcement, and other community members. And then as a former employee of Planned Parenthood, I've been one of the leading advocates to protecting abortion access here in the state of Arizona, as well as sex education, making sure that we are promoting laws that will make sure that our kids are better prepared when they go and make choices that may impact their lives. So I'm really excited about this opportunity to run for what it was Gabby's old seat. I've been endorsed by multiple organizations, and you can go to Daniel Hernandez for Congress.com and sign up to volunteer. You can sign up to get on our mailing list, but more importantly, you can join us in the movement to make sure that we keep this seat in Democratic control. After redistricting, it's a district that went from a Biden plus 11 to a Biden plus 1. It's actually less than 1% that he won by, so it's going to be a crucial hold seat for the Democratic Congress to continue to be in the majority. So with that, I will hand it back to Larry and say thank you all so much for allowing me to share a couple of thoughts with you guys.
Well, Daniel, thank you very much for your presentation. I want to open the floor now for questions. I encourage you to ask a live question by pulling your mouse down and clicking on the reactions button, and you'll see that there is an option there to raise hand. Our board member, Joe Danishevsky, is monitoring the chat. If you would rather have Joe ask your question for you, just put it in the chat. And with that, I did have a question for you on federal issues. Daniel, in April, Governor Ducey signed the third law in 2022 discriminating against LGBTQ couples. The most recent one said that adoption agencies and foster care agencies legally could discriminate against LGBTQ couples. So the state seems to be a lost cause, but is there anything you can do at the federal level to protect the LGBTQ community?
Yeah, I thank you for that question, Larry. So I think one of the things that we're seeing is after the 2020 elections here at the state of Arizona in the legislature, our biggest friends and allies on the Republican side are no longer here. We were able to, for many years, stop the trans athlete ban. We were able to stop the adoption bills that you just mentioned. So we were able to actually stop these bad pieces of legislation for the first 4 years that were there. Then in 2020, there was 2 women who were moderate Republicans who lost their seats. So then we saw a deluge of anti-LGBTQ legislation. A lot of it has been branded as something else. So it's about protecting girls in sports, protecting people who are, biological females is the way that they were framing it. So what we've seen is that at the legislative level, not just here in Arizona, but across the country, the LGBTQ community, particularly the trans kids, have become fodder for the Republicans and for the right to attack and to try and redo the culture wars. So I think one of the most important things that we need to do at the federal level is pass the Equality Act. I've been endorsed by the LGBTQ Victory Fund as well as by the LGBTQ caucus, which is called Equality PAC. And I'm proud to have the support of the openly LGBTQ members of Congress. But we know that in order to protect people in Arizona, in Alabama, in Georgia, and across the country, we can't rely on these state legislators that are targeting our communities. We need to pass comprehensive federal legislation to protect the LGBTQ community. So the Equality Act is one. I think we also need to do a lot more to make sure that we are highlighting the fact that LGBTQ families can raise happy and healthy kids. Because I think there is a lot of folks who came and said, under the guise of religious liberty, we are going to discriminate against the LGBTQ community, whether it's fostering kids or adopting them. And we need to make sure that what we're saying is you can have your religious freedoms, but we also have to, on balance, look at what is the best for these children, many of whom will either end up in unsafe situations or end up in foster care when they could be in a home where they are loved, where they are wanted, and will be able to be raised by loving parents. So I hope that answers your question, Larry, but I think passing the Equality Act to make sure that at the federal level, we have a guideline and a standard, because when we don't, we see legislatures around the country passing anti-LGBTQ legislation and trying to blame it on religious freedoms. Because I talk to faith leaders all the time, and faith leaders from many different faiths are saying this is not representative of who we are. This is a lot of different groups who are coming in and trying to make it harder for the LGBTQ community because they are on the fringes. But on the whole, folks feel like we need to make sure that kids have welcoming, loving, and homes where they'll be loved and nurtured and cared for.
Okay, we have a question from Lillian Fox. Go right ahead, Lillian.
You passed comprehensive sex ed in Sunnyside way before TUSD did. And I don't remember all hell breaking loose when you did that. But when TUSD did that, it was awful. What did you do that succeeded where TUSD seems to have not dealt with the public, well, not gotten the public on their side is what I would say.
Yeah. You know, I'm a coalition builder. As a gay Latino, I don't come in with a lot of power. I build my relationships and my power by being diligent about reaching out to as many folks as possible. So there's something that's secret that I'll reveal now because enough time has passed that it's been in Sunnyside policy now for a long time. What I did when I started talking to folks about passing comprehensive sex ed in Sunnyside was I didn't just come in and say, here's what we're going to do. I reached out to our counselors. I reached out to our nurses. I reached out to parents and said, what do you think about this? And the way that I framed it was our kids have some of the highest teenage pregnancy rates and some of the highest STI rates in the country, not just in Pima County, not just in Tucson, in the country. I was showing them growing rates of syphilis and gonorrhea and HIV and AIDS. So I built up community support before we ever even brought it to the board by framing it as, what do you think we should be doing to make sure that our kids are not having to deal with teenage pregnancies, having to deal with STI at such a young age? Secondly, I started going to the people that were going to be opposed and wanting them to understand the reason why we were doing this. So I actually sat down with then Bishop Kikanis, which everybody thought I was crazy for wanting to reach out to him. And I sat down with Bishop Kikanis and I said, Bishop, I know you're never going to agree with me on this. I know you're not going to support this, but I want you to understand why I, as a school board member and as a policymaker in Sunnyside, feel that it's important enough that we pass sex education so we're not having kids have kids and we're not having these children be impacted with STIs that may change their lives. And he sat back and he said, you know, Daniel, the church is very opposed to a lot of the things that you're going to do. But I agree with you. We can't let this keep happening. So we do not condone, we do not acknowledge, and we do not support what you're doing. But we're not going to get in the way of you doing what you think is best for the students in your district. And by going and talking to him, we were able to neutralize what would have been probably one of the biggest opponents of this. Because we knew, having seen what had happened, I worked at Planned Parenthood at the time. I had been working on sex education policies around the country and seeing that if you didn't reach out to the people and try and get them to at least be neutral, you were going to have to deal with them coming and screaming at your board meetings. And we saw people coming and screaming and shouting and saying, you're sexualizing children, you're doing all these terrible things. People who didn't even live in the district. So that's why I took it upon myself to go to people that I thought might be opposed, see if we could get them to neutral, build up that community support. And all of this was framed around making sure that parents knew what was in the curriculum. At no point did we try and surprise people. And I think that's one of the things that's really important. what happened a couple of years ago in TUSD was something that was disappointing, but not unexpected, because people didn't feel like they knew everything that was in it. There was a good process that was started, but because of changes in the board, every time we see things in TUSD, you see this big back and forth and this swing and this pendulum when things are happening in TUSD. So I think TUSD did as good of a job as it could have, given the difficult circumstances they did. But my advice to school districts and folks that are advocates for this is talk to folks beforehand. Don't just drop it on people, because when you surprise people and they don't feel included and they don't feel like their voices are heard, they're not going to be able to feel bought into this policy. And that's what we did in Sunnyside. We took a very long approach. We took an approach that a lot of people thought was crazy by talking to our opponents, but we did it because we knew if we didn't have that buy-in from community members, we'd never be able to get it across the finish line. So I hope, Lillian, that kind of answered your question, but it was a lengthy process. By the time we started and ended, we had been in the conversation for almost 2 years. And we had even secured a grant from the Department of Health to be able to implement this in Sunnyside, which was another huge win for us, because not only were we putting in this new curriculum that was built by the community, including the parents and families, but it was one that was going to be funded to make sure that we had the resources for our teachers to be able to do the professional development and the curriculum training that they needed to be able to do it well.
All right, thank you. Let's turn to Amelia Kramer. She has a question. Go ahead, Amelia.
Well, hi, Daniel. It's nice to see you, and thank you for being here at DGT. One of the things that I've always been amazed about with respect to you and your sister Alma in the legislature is you're an openly gay man advocating on behalf of the LGBTQ community. You're Hispanic, you're Latino, you're a crime victim, you're got family members in the Jewish community, a religious minority, and yet you're somehow able to work with the far-right Republicans in the Arizona legislature, which seems to me to be just a miracle, to actually get things done. And I'm wondering if you anticipate that it's going to be more or less dysfunctional with the U.S. Congress.
It's hard to know, because there are 435 members. But I like to talk about one specific example, Amelia, and thank you for that question. When I first got to the legislature, there was a woman who was named Maria Sims. She was a very conservative state lawmaker from Fountain Hills and the northern part of Phoenix. When she came in, people jokingly referred to her as conservative Barbie. They said she is, the prototype for the most conservative. She is not fond of Democrats. She doesn't talk to Democrats. And I remember when I met her, she was very gruff. And she said, I don't like Democrats. I don't agree with you guys on all these things, and gave me a litany of things that we didn't agree on. And I said, well, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to find something that we do agree on. We served in the Judiciary Committee together, and there was a couple of bills where I picked up that one of the things that she was really concerned about was protecting the victims of sexual assault. I found out that was something that she was passionate about. It was also something that I was passionate about. So I did some research, and I was actually approached by a member of our community who said, there's a law in place that says that if you are the victim of domestic violence, you are able to get out of a lease where you are unsafe, as long as there's a police report and the landlord's required to let you go. But if you are the victim of sexual assault and you don't have a relationship with the person who that sexual assault was committed by, there is no legal requirement for the landlord to let you out. Well, I was shocked to hear that this was the case, because if you live in an apartment building with 500 units and you get raped by one of your neighbors, there's no guarantee that you have a relationship pre-existing with this gentleman or with this individual. So I went to Maria and I said, Maria, this is a problem. Most landlords are good actors who will let people out of their leases, but we're not doing this for the good actors. We're doing this to make sure that the protection is there so that no one ever has to deal with the stress of having been sexually assaulted and then having to stay in an unsafe place. So she said, okay, I like the idea. Let's work on the bill. We got the bill done. We took it to the chair of the Judiciary Committee, Eddie Farnsworth, who was the one that killed almost every meaningful piece of criminal justice reform in the last 2 decades. And he said, your bill's unconstitutional. I don't like it. So then I said, oh God, we're done. We made a valiant effort. And then Maria said, no, I am now bought in. You have done the work. We are going to get this done. I don't care what I have to do. He is going to hear this bill. So she and I kept pestering him. He added it to the last agenda, the last Judiciary Committee hearing. We passed it unanimously out of the committee. We got it to the State House floor, passed it 60-0, get it over to the Senate. And then Steve Smith, who was the chair of the Public Safety Committee, refused to hear the bill. He said, too many men are being accused of sexual assault that are innocent, and I don't want to demonize them. And I said, well, the facts don't actually bear that out. If anything, there is an underreporting of sexual assault. But you know what? I understand that you're concerned. The bill actually addresses your concerns. And he said, well, now it's too late. Your bill's dead. Try again next year. And Maria and I sat down. And again, this is the woman who, when I started by telling me all the things she hated about Democrats. And we said, we have to find a way. We cannot continue to let another year pass where there are people who are having to live in an unsafe environment. So we went to the majority leader now, Ben Toma of the Republican caucus here in the House, and said, you have a bill that's germane. We can amend our language onto your bill and it'll get all the way through. And he said, Daniel, why would I do this favor for you? I said, it's not about doing it for me. It's about doing it for those victims who are needing somebody to be an advocate and be a champion. So we were able to get the bill amended on, and his requirement was get me 5 Democrats to vote for the bill. Well, we got a wide bipartisan support for the bill. We were able to get it passed, and it eventually got signed into law by the governor. So for me, I don't like spending time with people who I don't agree with, but in the legislature, I have surrounded by people who I don't agree with. I've had to work with people who've called me, horrible names. And then the next week we have to work on a bill together. My orientation at the legislature has always been, how do I actually work with the people that I can on the things that I agree with? And that means not demonizing my colleagues unless they deserve it. And sometimes they deserve it. But for the most part, saying, I'm going to focus on the areas where we agree, not the areas where we don't. And when people tell me that something is impossible and that you can't get it done, that's just fuel for me to work even harder. So when people told me Maria Sims hated Democrats, I built that relationship with her. I found out what were the things that made her tick. I sat down, I got to know her. I got to know who she was as a person. Then I think the other thing that's really important for me is not just finding the things that we can agree on, but trying to educate and push my colleagues. The reason we were able to repeal no promo homo in 2019 was not because the women who were the Republicans, who were the co-sponsors with me, loved the LGBTQ community and were the biggest advocates. When I met them, they were still learning about us. I had to spend 2 years educating my colleagues on the Republican side about what it meant to be a gay man in the legislature. And then bringing in trans people, bringing in lesbians, bringing in other people so they could learn more. So my goal as a legislator is always build relationships, find out what makes them tick, and then push them a little bit by educating them about the things that I care about. Because we have found some really uncommon allies and friends by building those relationships and then using that as a foundation to educate. So when I get to Congress, I'm going to be doing the same thing. And then I'll share one last thing. Alma is on the call, so I have to mention it. Every year, one of my Republican colleagues, Tim Dunn, hosts a dove hunt in Yuma. And he invites all 90 lawmakers. And every year, without fail, there are only 2 Democrats, or 3. There was one time that there was 3 of us that went, go down to Yuma to dove hunt. I like to go because 1, I'm a better shot than most of the Republicans who are city boys. And 2, I also get to spend time with my colleagues in a setting where it's not just at the legislature where we're screaming at each other. I get to meet them, get to know their families. So then when I'm advocating for the things that I care about, it's not just Daniel, the person who yells at me about bills. It's the one who came and spent time and got to know my wife. I still get texts from Tim's wife on a regular basis because we've become friends. And I think that's what I like to do. I like to build relationships. I get to know my colleagues because it's a lot harder to vote against the LGBTQ community when you have a face behind it. It's a lot harder to vote against women and women's rights when you're thinking of people that I've brought into the Capitol because of that relationship. So that's always been my orientation. And it's something that I'm really focused on is building relationships, getting a time to get to know people. And if I could do it in the Arizona State House where we have some of the craziest legislators, I'll probably be able to find a couple of allies in Congress who, again, I won't agree with everything on, but I don't need to agree with everything. I just need to find the things where we can find consensus and move those forward.
Okay, thank you, Daniel. Turning now to a federal issue, the We have a question from Janice Siegel, who is inquiring about your stance on climate change. For instance, there's already a bill in Congress, number 2307, that would create a carbon tax and dividend to homeowners. How can we get some action on climate change?
I think when I'm talking about climate change, I've already been working on this as an issue as a legislator for a couple of years. We're actually right now in the middle of a process where the governor has proposed a new so-called water authority, which has a lot of problems with it. So we all understand conservation is not enough to get us out of the mega drought that we're in. We need to make sure that people understand and acknowledge that climate change is real. And a lot of my colleagues at the legislature don't. So we need to get everybody on the same page. Climate change is happening, and Arizona will not continue to be successful if we do not take drastic action now to ensure that the future of Arizona is protected. And that means doing more to ensure that we have the water supply for the new people that are coming in. So part of that, I think, is one, augmenting water where possible. There has been for years conversations about massive infrastructure projects to do desalination. That's not going to be enough. Conservation is not going to be enough. We need to get innovative, and we need to work with the people that are using water. Some of our biggest uses of water are agriculture here in Arizona. But we can't just show up to a farmer whose family's been doing the same thing for generations and say, your job is now obsolete because there's not enough water. We need to do more to help prepare our economy for the future. And that means growing less water intensive crops, getting more forms of irrigation that requires less water. There's a wonderful company out of Israel that right now is coming before the legislature to partner with the University of Arizona Cooperative and is asking for $30 million to do tests and studies here in Arizona on their technology called NDRIP, which uses 80% less water to irrigate the same amount of crops that we're using now. So that kind of technology, I think, would be an important and meaningful thing. And then a couple of years ago, there was a bill that was here at the state legislative level that was really important to protecting those who are, those folks who are users of solar power. So in Arizona, there was a tax court ruling that said that you could not have a zero valuation on a solar panel that was leased. So that meant that for people who had bought solar panels and were leasing them, they were going to get hit with a big tax bill. So we had to come in during the middle of a session a couple of years ago and work with companies like Tesla and other solar companies to say, we need to make sure that people are not suddenly hit with a massive tax bill, because it shouldn't just be the people who can afford to buy the solar panels outright that get the tax break because the tax court had this ruling. We need to fix this problem and protect Arizona taxpayers who want to move towards sustainable power, who want to move to solar panels. So I was able to work, and we built a bipartisan coalition so that none of the people who had bought solar panels that were leased were going to get with a massive tax bill because of the court ruling. We got that done to protect the solar power users. But then I said, okay, let's work to do more to encourage research in things like storage, because we know that the only way we're going to make it so that we can continue to move towards a greener model is if we actually have the battery capacity and the storage so that you can use your electricity, that you do it not just in the middle of the day when the sun is out, but do it in the middle of the night. But storage is not there yet. So what we did is we worked together and we created a tax credit so that we could actually incentivize research at the universities and for different companies to look into battery and solar storage for renewables. So I'm really pleased to have joined Solar Neighbors United to call on the Congress and to call on President Biden to pass the $500 billion package that was a part of the Build Back Better program to ensure that we invest in not just our hard infrastructure, but in our future infrastructure for green power, for more renewable resources, working to make sure that we're investing in things like water conservation and augmentation. So for me, it's a problem that we need to tackle in a lot of different ways, but we need to do it soon because Arizona is reaching a crisis point where we are seeing dozens of people moving each and every single day to communities where there may not be enough water for them in a few years unless we take actions now. But the governor's plan, the water authority, is a gimme to the friends that he made who donated to his campaigns. And we can't have the people that are the worst users and who are the least likely to actually protect Arizona's water be the ones making decisions about where Arizona water should be and how it should be conserved.
Okay, let's turn to Andrea Kennedy. She's got a question. Go ahead, Andrea.
Oh, thank you, Larry. Yeah, Daniel, you have a medical background, so I was hoping you could answer this. When someone is born transgender and say they're a male, from what I understand, they have the hormones that allow them to deposit bone cells and build muscle mass, and then later they realize they'd like to be true to themselves. So, but if you're a male and you have this bone density and muscle mass, wouldn't that give you an advantage over someone who's born a girl with less bone density and less muscle mass? This has always confused me.
Yeah. And Andrea, I want to say thank you for that question, because this is something that we're all learning about. I think the fact that trans people are coming out now in numbers that we've never seen is not because there are more trans people now than there were before. It's that now we have language to be able to talk about these things, and people feel safer coming out as trans. So when we're looking at the trans athlete ban that passed here in Arizona, we killed it for 3 years, but it passed this year because Republicans did not care about protecting girls, which is what they said they were doing. They were trying to score points and trying to give a win to Kathy Herod at the Center for Arizona Policy. So the bill and the language is about protecting girls because of an unfair advantage that boys may have who transition and who are trans. But the reality is, in Arizona, we already have the IAI, the Arizona Interscholastic Association, which actually governs all sports at the K-12 level. And in the last decade, they have put into place a policy where you actually have to get permission as a trans girl or a trans boy to be able to participate in intramural sports and in sports here in the state of Arizona. And in the last decade that they've had that policy, less than 10 kids have even applied and asked to play. So when that bill was brought forth, it was because there was a decision in a Connecticut, competition where a girl ended up losing a biological cisgendered female lost to a trans girl. Well, what I kept asking here in Arizona and yet have not gotten an example is we have yet to have an issue here in Arizona where a trans girl has beat or won a title or taken something away from a cisgendered female. But at the end of the day, it wasn't about competitions and awards and scholarships, which is what the Republicans were trying to talk about. It was about ensuring that all kids had the opportunity to be able to participate in school sports. Because when you're playing, baseball, softball, you're not necessarily doing this for a competition. You're not doing this to get a scholarship. Most of the kids who are playing sports in our schools are not going to be future NBA stars or WNBA stars. They're doing it because they want a place to be accepted, to feel connected to their peers. So that's why we oppose the bill. I think there's a lot of questions about the medical side, but the reality is this was about letting kids play sports in schools. This was not necessarily just about getting scholarships and awards and, people playing at a high level of sports. This is literally kids wanting to play soccer with their middle schools. With their classmates. This was about students going to high school and playing on the freshman team or on the junior varsity team. So when we were talking about the trans sports, Republicans were trying to frame it as we're protecting girls who want to win scholarships and awards, but the vast majority of our kids playing sports in schools are not doing it for that. They're looking for a community, they're looking for acceptance, and they're also looking to be able to get out and do exercise and participate just like any other kids. So I think the question that you have about hormones, there are a lot of things that can happen, and being trans does not happen in one way or another. You can take hormone blockers or you can take different hormones. So if you're a trans woman and you're a trans girl, you can take estrogen to start producing, estrogen, but you can take testosterone blockers to stop, having puberty. But getting into the nitty gritty is something that I think should be between a child, their family, and their doctor. It shouldn't be the legislature telling you, if your hormones are at this level, you're not allowed to play, or you're not allowed to play because we don't like the way that you look, the way you dress, the way you identify. And a couple of years ago, when this bill was first introduced, we called it the Show Me Your Genitals bill, because the way that it was originally drafted, you didn't even have to have proof that the other student was trans. You could just say, I didn't like that I lost the sport, so I want to challenge that person. And now it was on that child and on that family to go and get a genital examination by a doctor because they were uncomfortable and wanted to show, is this person trans or not? So I hope that kind of started answering your question. I'd be happy to talk to you offline. There are people who are much better versed in this than I am. But I think the key point that I was making to my colleagues at the legislature was, this is not about competition. This is not about scholarships and awards. This is about letting kids be kids and letting kids who are vulnerable, who have some of the highest suicide rates, some of the highest mental health declines because of who they are, participate and just be treated like any other child. And I think that was the crucial point that we made and tried to really say, here's why we're doing this. Because if you really want to protect kids, you don't ostracize them and cut them out of participating.
All right, Daniel, thank you very much. We've run out of time, and I know there are
Larry,
still
really quickly, I'm going to put in my email so for the folks that we didn't get a chance to answer their questions, and also if anybody's interested in volunteering, we're doing a lot of canvassing and phone banking. So I'll type that in the chat box so if people want to reach out, since we didn't get to every question.
Well, you took the words out of my mouth. Exactly. I was wondering if you could round up with what people can do to support you and how we can get in touch with you.
Typing it into the chat box, and then the website is going to be there as well. But thank you so much for the opportunity to join you all. Hopefully we'll be able to see you in person in the next couple of weeks and months as we are working hard to make sure we keep this seat in Democratic control.
All right. Thank you very much. I want to thank everybody for coming and listening to your presentation. We've run out of time, and we'll see you at the next meeting. Thanks very much for coming. Take care, everybody.
One day, when the war is won, we will be sure, we will be sure. Oh, Lord.